The Fed can't stimulate the economy. It never could. It just stimulates inflation. That's always the Fed's cure. For every economic problem, their cure is to create inflation. And it's kind of like a magic wand that they can wave. But now that inflation is the problem, inflation can't solve that problem anymore. But we're in a situation where either we have to come clean and default, or we just inflate everything away. If the government does the right thing, well then, they can't point fingers anymore. So that's why they're going to create inflation. Because again, the public doesn't even understand what inflation is. They still think inflation is rising prices. So they blame the people who raised the prices. If they understood that inflation was expanding the money supply, they would know exactly who to blame, because they know who expands the money supply. And the money supply is expanded to fund the deficits. The deficits are skyrocketing. The national debt is $35.3 trillion. Biden is going to break Trump's record for the most debt in a single term. Obama still has the most debt of a president, but he had 8 years. Trump and Biden only had 4 years. But whoever wins the next election, I think whether it's Harris or Trump, either one is going to break the record just set by Biden. I mean, the deficits are going up. We're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. I mean, maybe Harris will be able to beat Obama's two-term record in a single term. I mean, Biden has given him a run for his money. He's not going to be that far off of outdoing 8 years of Obama with just 4 years of Biden. But now interest on the national debt is over $1 trillion a year. That's a big program that they can't cut unless they default. It's now bigger than the defense budget. We're spending more on interest on our debt than we are spending to defend the country, which is really the primary function of the federal government. That's why we have a federal government, for national defense. That's the sole purpose that they're supposed to serve. And now we have to spend more paying interest on money they borrowed to do things that they had no constitutional authority to spend money on. But within another year or two, interest on the national debt is going to be bigger than either Social Security or Medicare. And those expenses are rising too. They're just not rising as fast as interest. That's one of the main reasons that the Fed's about to cut, because they know that the government can't afford the interest rates where they are, because all this debt keeps maturing. And so in order to bail out the government, the Fed has to cut rates. But the thing is, they can't afford 4% either. I mean, 5.25 is worse, but even if they go down to 4, it's still too much. Because remember, a lot of this money was borrowed at 25 basis points. And the current debts are so big, we're running $3 to $4 trillion deficits every single year. Kamala is worse than Trump on so many levels. At least Trump likes capitalism. Kamala Harris is a socialist, a Marxist. I mean, she was raised by a Marxist professor. Donald Trump was raised by his businessman father. So at least he believes in these principles and might fight to try to preserve them. Whereas Kamala Harris is going to try to blame all the problems that government created on capitalism and use that as an excuse, to implement socialist policies. We got just a taste of that with the price control stuff. But I mean, there's a lot more that she's got up her sleeve that she doesn't want anybody to see. But you don't want Kamala Harris as president when it hits the fan, because the types of policies that are going to be pursued are going to be so bad. But also just from civil liberties perspective, I mean, the direction that the Democrats are going through not just on economic policy, but about stifling even your freedom of speech. I mean, basically, if they win, things will get really bad and we won't even have a right to complain about it. That'll be disinformation, right? It's like a government, propaganda. They might as well have a propaganda department in the government, like call a spade and have a ministry of propaganda. But what they're doing and the wars, at least if we get a Trump administration, maybe we can have an end to some wars. I mean, Trump is not a fan of war. He's definitely not an establishment guy. And that's what we need. I mean, the establishment is the problem, whether it's the Republican establishment or the Democratic establishment. We need to break free of that. But Trump still hasn't gotten his arms around the magnitude of the problem. He still thinks that, he can solve it. In fact, he still thinks that when he was president, America was great, that he made it great. And no, he didn't. I mean, the deficits got bigger, including the trade deficits got bigger. He made that a cornerstone of his initial campaign, shrinking the trade deficit, and went up. And of course, went up even more under Biden, but he didn't turn the trend, and he didn't turn the trend on debt. Trump didn't shrink government. He did a good job with deregulation. He didn't go far enough, but at least he went in that direction. But he left a lot on the table, but he didn't reduce government spending. In fact, he added the Space Force. I mean, we needed that like a hole in the head. We needed to get rid of agencies and departments. We need to do what Milei is doing in Argentina. That's what we need here in the United States. It's just that things haven't gotten bad enough for the public to, be willing to swallow that kind of medicine. I mean, the good news is it will get bad enough, right? If that's good news, we'll do the right thing eventually. But if Harris is president, we got no chance of doing the right thing. Not with her and whoever controls her. Because, even if Harris wins, who knows who's pulling the strings? She'll obviously be a puppet. The debt is going to increase exponentially while she's president. And so we'll be at 40 trillion. We could easily be at 50 trillion of total national debt during her first term. If we're doing 4 or 5 trillion of debt per year, who knows? But there are other things, other plans that she has that if they pass would really create a lot of problems for the U.S. economy. But what is going to happen is our creditors are going to come to the unmistakable conclusion that we can't pay our bills, that the numbers are just too big, that it is impossible for the U.S. government to honor its commitments. Everybody thinks, the U.S. government is never going to default. We need to default. Default is the best way out of this debt situation. But if we don't have the integrity to default, if the politicians can't do that, then they're going to inflate. And inflation is actually worse than default from the perspective of the creditors and everybody else who owns dollars. People are going to lose more money to inflation than they would to default. Because if the U.S. government defaulted, they wouldn't have to completely default. We wouldn't have to tell people you get nothing. We could give them 30 cents on the dollar, something like that. We could reduce the debt to some manageable level. Inflation could wipe out more than 90% of it, maybe 99. Who knows if we have hyperinflation. But I think that when our creditors come to that conclusion that they should have come to years ago, but they didn't. But when they come to that conclusion, nobody is going to want to hold U.S. treasuries or any bonds that are denominated in U.S. dollars because they know they're not going to get their purchasing power back. They know there's going to be a default through inflation. And so then it's impossible for the U.S. government to borrow money. It's impossible for almost anybody to borrow U.S. dollars. So how's the economy going to survive that? It's just going to implode. Can't the Air Force handle that? Space is up in the air. I was against Homeland Security. We never should have created that. The Defense Department should have handled Homeland Security. In fact, that's what the Defense Department is supposed to be, Homeland Security. The problem is the Defense Department is all over the world defending other countries. That's why we need a whole separate branch to defend us. Well, let's use our armed forces to defend the homeland, and let's not even have a Department of Homeland Security. Look, we have to streamline government. Government is way too expensive. That's why we have all this inflation. And that's why the politicians have to come clean, because the public doesn't want inflation, but they want all this government. That's the trade-off. If you don't want inflation, then we have to have less government, because inflation is the way we're paying for government. We're not paying for it all with taxes. We're paying for it with higher prices, because the government isn't taking our money and spending it. It's printing money and spending that. But when they do that, they take our purchasing power. So if you want to get rid of inflation, you got to get rid of a lot of government. And that includes a lot of agencies and departments. So we got to streamline all these departments. Like, look, the Department of Education and Energy, we didn't even have those until Jimmy Carter. So how did we make it to 1980 without an energy department or an education department? We had education, we had energy, we didn't have those departments that are wasting money. We got to get rid of them. The Department of Energy doesn't produce 1 barrel of oil. In fact, all they do is prevent us from producing oil. And the Department of Education, we have a much worse education system now, thanks to the Department of Education, than we had before it existed. So let's get rid of it, right? And there's a lot of agencies that we don't need at all. They're not even authorized by the Constitution. The word education isn't in the Constitution anywhere. There's nothing in there that says the government's supposed to get involved in education. So why are they doing it? Let's get rid of it. And these things weren't even supposed to be temporary. They were supposed to be permanent. So it's even harder to get rid of them. $10,000 gold is just a 4x gain, right, from here. So 4 times. Gold from 2001 to 2011 went up more than that. 4x in 4 years would be pretty big. But I think that there's a lot of pent-up price appreciation because from 2011 to basically 2023, the price of gold didn't really go anywhere. It got to 1900 in 2011 and it got to about 2000 in 2023. So in 14 years, the price of gold didn't go anywhere. It just went sideways. And that was kind of the environment that kind of gave rise to Bitcoin because people were getting frustrated that gold wasn't going anywhere. And so they were buying Bitcoin and Bitcoin was going up. But now gold has just started to rise again. We've taken out all that resistance. And so I think you're going to see a big leg up in the price of gold. That's going to kind of mirror the magnitude of that initial move from 300 to 1900, which is a six-fold increase. But I think you're going to see that increase in a shorter period of time than the 10 years that it took for the other six-fold increase. But it's going to be proportionate to that. And I think the catalyst is going to be the rate cuts, the resurgence of inflation at the same time that the economy is in recession. And that sidelines the Fed from even pretending it's going to fight inflation. And so without that pretense, the bottom falls out of the dollar. And I think the stampede, the quiet walk out of the dollar is going to become a stampede. We really accelerated the need to get out of the dollar with the sanctions on Russia. And, that was a big wake-up call to the rest of the world that, you better de-dollarize or you're next. What's happening to Russia and Putin can just as easily happen to you if you're dumb enough to keep U.S. dollars, right, as your reserve and U.S. treasuries. So, the world got the message loud and clear, I'm getting out of this currency. And so that's already underway, but that is going to accelerate when there's an urgency to get out, because then they start to see the dollar falling. And then, you don't want to be the last one holding the bag with the dollar. You want to get out while you can. So I think you're going to see that big break in the dollar. Their all-time record low for the dollar index is about 70. And right now we're just above 100, 101. So, we have a ways to go to crack to all-time record lows. Again, I said we'll crack to an all-time low against the Swiss franc probably early next year. We'll be at a record low against the Swiss franc. But it may take a couple years for the dollar index itself to make a record low, which would, mean a big move up in the euro, the pound, the yen. As bad as those currencies are, they got a lot of problems there too. We just got them in spades. But once the dollar really cracks through that support, it could just free fall. And that's going to be a big catalyst for gold. You don't have to look for another dirty shirt in that hamper. That's what everybody misses. Gold is not in the hamper. Gold is not a dirty shirt. It's the cleanest shirt we got. And that's what would replace the dollar. Because before the dollar was the reserve currency, gold was the reserve. That's what all the central banks, including the United States, held as the reserve. And when we convinced the world to leave the gold standard for the dollar standard, it was with the understanding that we would stay on the gold standard. And not only would the dollar be backed by gold, the dollar was gold. It was defined as a weight of gold. But not only could those paper notes, Federal Reserve notes, not only would they be backed by gold, but they would be redeemable on demand in gold. So even though Roosevelt made it illegal for U.S. citizens to convert their Federal Reserve notes to gold, foreign governments could always take their Federal Reserve notes and get gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. And so when we broke our pledge in 1971, when we defaulted on our promise and we told the world that the notes are now worthless, that they used to be IOUs for gold and now they're IOUs for nothing, the dollar got marked down, but it didn't get counted out. It lost about 2/3 of its value against the Deutschmark, the yen, the franc, but it stayed as the reserve currency. And that was the beginning of the huge problem, because once we realized that the world was dumb enough to hold our worthless paper as a reserve, that's what started the massive deficits. That's how we went from the world's biggest creditor to the world's biggest debtor. That's how we went from large trade surpluses to massive trade deficits, because we could print money and get stuff for free. And so when the dollar starts to collapse and central banks want to divest and everybody wants to get rid of dollars, they're not going to say, okay, well, let's try the euro on for size. Why would they want to do that? Why should the euro be the reserve? The yen? Are you going to use the yen? Come on, the yen isn't. They can't use the pound sterling anymore. There are no currencies that are worthy of the dollar's crown. The dollar's not worthy of it either. So what the world is going to do is go right back to gold. That is the obvious choice that everybody is ignoring. Talk about like the elephant in the living room. So people are complacent. Oh, the dollar will be the world's reserve forever because no other currency can. Paper currency needs to be backed by real money. That's the problem. We have a monetary system right now without any money. We need to anchor the system with real money. The paper is a money substitute. It only has value if there's real money backing it up. And gold is the best real money that we've discovered. And that's where we're headed. But the history of the world for hundreds of years is gold is money. And that history hasn't been rewritten. Gold's going to continue to be money for a long time. This period where it wasn't used as money will be a footnote in history and a lesson to be learned. So this has created this false sense of complacency that the dollar will remain the reserve currency indefinitely because there's no other currency that can take its place. But people are missing the elephant in the living room. The obvious choice to replace the dollar is what the dollar replaced, and that's gold. And so that is where we are headed. We are going to return to the gold standard. That is the norm throughout modern history, was to have gold as money. I mean, that's the problem with our current monetary system, is that we don't have any money anymore. We just have paper. But currency needs to be backed up by real money, and that is where we're headed. So it's not a question of will or even if we're going to return to a gold standard. The question is when. How soon is it going to happen? The sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. But I think we're a lot closer now than we've been in the past. And I think that circumstances are certainly evolving in a way that makes not only that return inevitable, but close at hand.